It was the summer of 1997, and the Whiskey A Go-Go on the Sunset Strip was packed to the walls with leather, sweat, and the unmistakable stench of cheap bourbon that had soaked into those floors for decades. Lemmy Kilmister had just walked off stage after a blistering set that left the monitors buzzing, and he was doing what he always did after a show, standing near the backstage entrance with a Jack Daniels and Coke in one hand and a Marlboro Red burning between his fingers, signing whatever fans shoved in front of him, because Lemmy believed that the people who paid to hear his music deserved at least a handshake and a nod. The line was long that night, mostly men in their 30s and 40s wearing faded Motorhead shirts, but near the end stood someone who did not belong there at all, a small boy, no older than 9, with messy brown hair and a Motorhead shirt that hung past his knees like a dress, holding a crumpled piece of paper in both hands the way a soldier might hold a grenade, tight, afraid, and absolutely determined to deliver it. Nobody in that line knew what was about to happen. Nobody knew that this child's words would hit Lemmy harder than any critic, any drug, any border arrest ever had. And nobody could have predicted that somewhere in that same building, Johnny Cash, the man in black himself, was sitting quietly in a corner booth, watching everything unfold, about to do something that would remain one of rock and roll's most beautiful secret stories for nearly 3 decades. If this is your first time on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here are the ones the music industry never wanted you to hear. The line that cut deeper than any blade. Now, to understand why what happened next mattered so much, you have to understand something about Lemmy that most people got completely wrong. The world saw a man who drank a bottle of Jack Daniels every day for 50 years, a man who consumed enough amphetamines to kill a horse, who claimed to have slept with over 1,000 women, and the world decided that Lemmy Kilmister did not care about anything. But that was never the truth. Lemmy cared so deeply about certain things that he built an entire fortress of whiskey and volume and leather around himself, so nobody could see the soft parts underneath. He cared about loyalty, which is why being fired from Hawkwind in 1975 at a Canadian border crossing, after years of faithful service, nearly destroyed him in ways the drugs never could. He cared about honesty, which is why he never once pretended to be something he was not. And most of all, though he rarely spoke about it, Lemmy cared about children. He had a son named Paul Indare, born in 1967, and the relationship was complicated in the way that every relationship with Lemmy was complicated, full of love but fractured by distance, by touring, by the lifestyle that made him a god on stage and a ghost at home. So when that 9-year-old boy finally reached the front of the line, and looked up at the man with the mutton chops and the bass-calloused fingers, what came out of that child's mouth was not a request for an autograph. The boy looked straight at Lemmy and told him, with the kind of brutal honesty that only children are capable of, that his father had left home because of Motorhead. That his dad started listening to Motorhead, then started dressing like Lemmy, then started drinking like Lemmy, then started disappearing to concerts and bars and eventually just disappeared altogether, and that his mother cried every night, and that it was Lemmy's fault. The backstage area went dead silent. The roadies stopped moving. The fans behind the boy froze. And Lemmy Kilmister, the man who had stared down cops and customs agents and record executives, and once told a journalist that he was not afraid of anything on this earth, stood there with his Jack Daniels slowly tilting in his hand, and said absolutely nothing. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had said something to him that he had no defense against. But what nobody in that room knew yet, what would only become clear in the hours that followed, was that Johnny Cash had heard every single word from his corner booth, and the man in black was already reaching for his jacket. The ghost in the corner booth asterisk. Johnny Cash being at the Whiskey A Go-Go that night was not as strange as it might sound. By 1997, Cash was in the middle of his extraordinary late career resurrection, working with producer Rick Rubin on the American recording series that would redefine everything the world thought about the man in black. Rubin's studio was not far from the Sunset Strip, and Cash had developed a habit of wandering into clubs in the evening, sometimes to listen, sometimes to remember what raw music sounded like. Cash and Lemmy had crossed paths before, because despite the gap between country and heavy metal, these two men had far more in common than anyone would have guessed. Both came from working-class backgrounds with absent fathers. Both had struggled with substance abuse in ways that would have killed ordinary men. Both had been written off by the music industry and simply refused to stop. And both, beneath the armor of their public personas, carried a tenderness they showed only in unguarded moments. So when Cash heard that boy's words cut through the backstage noise, he did not look away or treat it as someone else's problem. Cash had raised children of his own, and he knew what it felt like to be the man who disappeared, because he had been that man during his darkest years with amphetamines and alcohol. He knew the guilt of an empty kitchen at 6 in the morning when you should be making breakfast for your kids, but instead you are on a tour bus or in a hotel room you cannot even remember. And he knew that the boy standing in front of Lemmy was not angry. The boy was hurt, which was so much worse because anger burns out but hurt just sits there, quiet and patient, waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it. Two outlaws and one broken kid. Lemmy had not moved. The cigarette between his fingers had burned down almost to the filter, and he still had not spoken a word. Then a hand appeared on the boy's shoulder, and when the boy turned around, he found himself looking at a tall man dressed entirely in black, with deep lines carved into a face that looked like it had been chiseled from the side of a mountain. Johnny Cash knelt down so that he was eye level with the boy, because his own mother had taught him that you should never talk down to anyone, especially someone small enough to be talked down to by everybody. Cash did not try to fix anything. He did not tell the boy that his father leaving was not Lemmy's fault. He did not lecture about personal responsibility or the complexities of addiction. Instead, Cash asked the boy what his name was. The boy said his name was Danny, and from that one small act of treating a hurt child like a human being instead of a problem, something shifted in the room. Lemmy pulled a chair over and sat down so that he too was at the boy's level. And now there were two of the most legendary figures in American music sitting in metal folding chairs in the back hallway of the Whisky A Go Go, giving their complete attention to a 9-year-old named Danny who had come expecting a fight, and instead found something he had not experienced in a long time, the feeling of being listened to by men who actually looked him in the eye. What happened over the next hour was something the handful of witnesses would talk about for years. Lemmy did not apologize because Lemmy never apologized, that was his code. But he did something far harder. He was honest. He told the boy that rock and roll had taken things from him too, that it had stolen years from his own son, years he could never get back, and that if he could change one thing it would not be the drugs or the drinking, it would be the mornings he was not there when his boy woke up. This was not a speech. It was barely above a whisper, and it was the most vulnerable anyone backstage had ever seen Lemmy Kilmister. Cash sat there nodding slowly, because every word was a mirror of his own failures as a father during the years when pills had turned him into a stranger in his own house. And Danny, this 9-year-old who had walked into a rock club carrying enough anger to burn it down, just sat there between these two broken, magnificent outlaws and listened, because somehow, without planning it, Lemmy and Johnny Cash had done the one thing nobody else in Danny's life had thought to do. They told him the truth. The letter that nobody was supposed to see. But the story did not end that night. What stayed buried in the personal files of those close to both men was that Johnny Cash went home and could not sleep. June Carter Cash later told friends that her husband sat at the kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning, writing by hand on his personal stationery, the kind with the simple black border that he used only for important letters. Cash had been profoundly affected by the look on that boy's face, and equally affected by what he saw in Lemmy's eyes, because he recognized that look. It was the look of a man reminded of his greatest failure, and Cash knew that reminders like that could either wake you up or break you down. So Cash wrote 2 letters that night. The first was to Danny, care of the Whisky A Go Go, because Cash had quietly asked the bartender and learned that Danny's mother had dropped him off without knowing what her son planned to say. In that letter, Cash told Danny something he had learned the hard way across decades of mistakes. He told the boy that the music did not make his father leave, that something was broken inside him that had nothing to do with Motorhead, and that the bravest thing a man can do is stay, and the second bravest thing is to forgive the one who could not. The second letter was to Lemmy, and what it contained was never fully revealed, but those who knew both men say that Cash wrote about fatherhood, about regret, about the specific pain that comes from knowing your child grew up watching you choose the road over the living room. Cash apparently told Lemmy that it was not too late, that it was never too late, and that children have a capacity for forgiveness that adults can barely comprehend. Lemmy received that letter at his apartment near the Rainbow Bar and Grill, and according to people close to him, he read it more than once, which was extraordinary because Lemmy did not reread anything, not reviews, not fan mail, not contracts. But this letter he kept. What changed after that night? In the months that followed, people around Lemmy noticed something different. It was not dramatic, because nothing about Lemmy was ever dramatic in the conventional sense. But the people who knew him best, the road crew, the bartenders at the Rainbow, the musicians who had played with him for decades, they noticed small shifts. Lemmy started calling his son Paul more often. Not every week, because that was never going to be his way, but more than before. And according to Paul Indare himself in later interviews, something had changed in the way his father spoke to him, as though a wall had come down just enough to let some light through. Lemmy also started doing something new at meet and greets. When kids showed up, and kids did show up because their parents brought them, Lemmy would stop the line and give them extra time. He would kneel down the way he had seen Cash do, and talk to them not as fans but as people, asking about school, about instruments they played. And the road crew learned to build extra time into the schedule because Lemmy would not be rushed when there was a child in the line. Meanwhile, Johnny Cash did something quietly remarkable. Through his network of contacts in the music industry and church communities around Nashville, Cash arranged for Danny and his mother to receive support, not money directly from himself, because Cash understood that charity given publicly becomes about the giver, but through foundations he had been involved with for years. Danny's mother received help with rent, groceries, and school supplies, and she never knew exactly where it came from. Cash did all of this without telling Lemmy, without telling the press, because for Johnny Cash, doing the right thing and being seen doing the right thing were 2 completely separate acts, and he was only interested in the first one. The reunion nobody expected asterisk. Nearly 2 years later, in the spring of 1999, Motorhead played a show at the Hollywood Palladium, and once again Lemmy was standing backstage after the set doing what he always did. The line of fans moved forward one by one, and somewhere near the middle of that line was a boy, taller now, 11 years old, wearing a Motorhead shirt that actually fit this time, and standing beside him was a woman with tired eyes and a nervous smile. When Danny reached the front of the line, Lemmy recognized him immediately. The crew members who witnessed this moment say that Lemmy's face did something they had almost never seen it do before. It softened. Not into a smile exactly, because Lemmy's face was not built for conventional smiles, but into something warmer, something that lived in the eyes rather than the mouth, and anyone who was close enough to see it understood that they were witnessing a private moment that happened to be taking place in a public space. Danny did not have a crumpled letter this time. He had a report card, straight A grades across the board, and at the bottom in the section where the teacher writes comments. His teacher had written that Danny was the most improved student in his class, and that his essay about personal heroes had made her cry. Danny had written about 2 men who sat down with him in the back of a rock club and told him the truth when everyone else in his life was too busy or too uncomfortable to do the same. Lemmy looked at that report card for a long time. Then he looked at Danny's mother, and something passed between them that did not require words, the kind of understanding that exists between people who have both been damaged by the same storm and survived it differently. Lemmy signed the report card. He signed it right below the teacher's comments, next to the A in English, and he wrote something that Danny's mother later said she would keep forever. Then Lemmy did something that the crew had never seen him do in all their years on the road. He asked Danny and his mother to wait, and he disappeared into the back for a few minutes, and when he came back, he was carrying a Rickenbacker bass guitar, not his main instrument but one of the backups, and he handed it to Danny and told the boy that if he was going to write about heroes, he might as well learn to play like one. Danny's mother started to protest, because a Rickenbacker is not a cheap instrument, but Lemmy just shook his head once, the way he shook his head when he had made a decision, and there was absolutely no point in arguing, and that was the end of the discussion. What nobody in that room knew was that Johnny Cash had once again been informed about the show, and while he was not there in person this time, he had called ahead and spoken to Lemmy's tour manager, and he had asked about the boy, and when he heard that Danny and his mother were planning to attend, Cash made sure that 2 tickets and backstage passes were waiting for them at the will call window, paid for out of his own pocket, because even from Nashville, even in the middle of recording sessions for what would become some of the most acclaimed albums of his entire career, Johnny Cash had not forgotten the boy from the Whisky. The bridge between two worlds. There is a reason this story matters beyond the heartwarming image of 2 legendary musicians helping a kid. It matters because of what it reveals about the men themselves. Lemmy Kilmister spent his entire public life cultivating an image of indestructibility. He was the man who drank whiskey like water, consumed enough speed to fuel a rocket, played bass at a volume that registered on seismographs. He once said that if he was going to die, he would die standing up, and when he actually did pass away on December 28, 2015, just 4 days after his 70th birthday, he was sitting in his favorite chair near the rainbow, playing a video game which was as close to standing up as his cancer-ravaged body would allow. The world mourned him as the ultimate rock and roll survivor, the man who refused to change for anyone. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth included nights like the one at the Whisky, moments where the armor cracked and the man underneath was visible, a man who knew what it felt like to fail as a father, and who, when confronted by a child's pain, did not run away from it. And Johnny Cash, who had built his own legend on the mythology of the outlaw, the prisoner's friend, the voice of the downtrodden, proved that the mythology was not a performance. Cash walked the line, as his most famous song declared, but sometimes the line was simpler than the one between love and madness. Sometimes it was just the line between seeing someone in pain and choosing to do something about it. Cash died on September 12, 2003, and when the news reached Lemmy at the Rainbow, he ordered a Jack Daniels and Coke, raised it toward the television where the news was playing, and stood there alone for a long time without saying a word. What Danny became. The final chapter of this story is perhaps the most remarkable. Danny, the 9-year-old boy who walked into the Whisky a go-go in 1997 carrying a crumpled piece of anger in his hands, grew up. He learned to play that Rickenbacker bass that Lemmy gave him, practiced until his fingers bled and then practiced some more. And by the time he was in his early 20s, he was playing in local bands around Los Angeles, not famous, not trying to be, just playing music because 2 men had shown him that music was not the thing that broke his family, but rather the thing that could put him back together. He kept Johnny Cash's letter in a frame on his wall. He kept Lemmy's signature on his report card in a drawer beside his bed. And when Lemmy died in 2015, Danny, now 27 years old, drove to the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Boulevard, where hundreds of fans had gathered to pay their respects, and he stood there in the crowd with his Motorhead shirt and his Rickenbacker calluses, and he grieved not just for a rock star, but for a man who once sat down in a metal folding chair in the back of a club and told him the truth about what it costs to live the life that everyone else only dreams about. There is a photograph somewhere, taken by a roadie whose name has been lost to time, of Lemmy and Johnny Cash sitting in those folding chairs backstage at the Whisky, with a small boy between them. In the photo, Cash is leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and Lemmy is holding his Jack Daniels at an angle, and the boy is looking up at both of them with an expression that is impossible to describe but impossible to forget. The expression of a child who came looking for someone to blame and found something better instead. That photograph has never been published. The people who have seen it say it is one of the most human images in the history of rock and roll, because it shows two giants at their smallest and most honest, stripped of their legends, stripped of their armor. Just two men who knew what it felt like to fail and who decided, on one unremarkable summer night in 1997, that they were not going to let a 9-year-old boy carry the weight of someone else's failure for the rest of his life. Lemmy once said that rock and roll was the most honest form of music because it did not pretend to be beautiful. But on that night, in the back hallway of a club on the Sunset Strip, rock and roll was the most beautiful thing in the world. Not because of the noise or the leather or the Jack Daniels, but because two men who had spent their lives being loud finally understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit down, shut up, and listen to a 9-year-old boy who just needs someone to hear him. That is the kind of story that does not make the headlines, that does not trend on social media, that does not fit neatly into the mythology of rock and roll excess and rebellion. But it is the kind of story that matters, because it reminds us that even the hardest men carry soft places inside them, and that sometimes, if you are very lucky, those soft places are exactly where the healing begins.